Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're not just talking leadership strategy. We're kind of tearing up the usual playbook. Our source material offers this incredibly detailed blueprint. It's for anyone building organizations, communities, even small teams, aiming for something really resilient, something that reproduces itself, something that lasts. Yeah. So our mission today is to unpack the core challenge these sources throw down. It feels pretty radical, actually. They argue most structures today are just fragile because they chase speed, size, attendance, all the stuff you can easily count, but they miss the deep stuff, right? The durable foundations, like internal formation, faithfulness. So we're here to look at their specific plan for moving from a, quote, fragile beginning to a sustainable self-propagating movement.
And what's really striking is that core tension they set up immediately. It is radical. They're basically saying, look, success, it can't be tied to just the usual market metrics. Forget just attendance numbers or, the quarterly financial bumps. Instead, the focus has to pivot completely to things like faithfulness, formation, and multiplication. This entire blueprint rests on the idea that real lasting growth isn't some frantic sprint for size. It's more like a careful, intentional apprenticeship in depth.
That's such a huge mental shift.
Yeah.
Reframing success like that, that's got to be the hardest pill for any leader to swallow, especially when all the pressure is for bigger numbers right now. Okay, so let's start where they do, with the diagnosis. Section 1 talks about what they call the survival trap, and honestly, it feels like a cycle every leader knows, whatever their field.
Oh, absolutely, the survival trap. Yeah, that's where momentum just goes to die. You see organizations, maybe they start small but have big dreams and they just stall. Why? Because the leaders get caught in these endless maintenance cycles. They're spending like 90% of their energy just keeping the current machine oiled and running, fixing yesterday's problems, trying to preserve the institution itself rather than actually, generating forward momentum.
It sounds like that chef who's always washing the same few dishes instead of actually cooking anything new or training the kitchen staff.
That's a perfect analogy. Exactly. And it's fueled by this deep scarcity mindset. They're trying so hard to protect what they have, which ironically stops them from investing the time, the energy, the focus needed to build what they could become. The fix they propose is a total reversal of those priorities, trading those flashy short-term wins for quiet, deep, foundational work.
That sounds incredibly countercultural. Everything today rewards the spectacle, the big event.
It really is. And they spell it out. You need to trade the polished events for, open, maybe messy, relational tables. Swap the expensive, imported experts for investing in your local, ordinary people, your saints. Prioritize quiet, consistent obedience over those quick, visible wins. This is the paradox they keep coming back to. Hidden roots, public root. They argue that when things get tough, when a crisis hits, structures built this way flex, the roots show, and the mission actually spreads instead of stalling out.
Okay, so if size isn't the main goal, if that's not the success metric we're chasing, we need new data points. Like if I'm a founder or a leader, maybe on a board, how do I show my stakeholders that this root growth thing is actually happening? What are the key leading indicators we should track?
Right. And this is crucial. It's where the philosophy meets, practical management. Forget just counting heads or dollars in the offering plate. The leading indicators have to track the health of the reproduction cycle. For instance, they say you should be tracking the number of new leaders you've apprenticed who are actively leading, say, small groups or new teams. Also, the percentage of weekly activities run by people who aren't the founders. That shows real decentralization is happening. And maybe most critical, the replication rate. So how many new groups or teams or even products were actually started by leaders you trained in the last year?
But hang on, how do you convince, say, a skeptical board or maybe an investor that these softer measures, these depth stories you mentioned, are really a viable metric, especially when they're demanding hard numbers on size and revenue growth? That feels like a tough sell.
Well, that's the productive friction, isn't it? The sources don't say ditch quantitative data entirely. They just reframe it. The number of leaders trained is a hard number. But they insist quite strongly that numbers without the narrative are kind of empty. You have to match those quantitative leading indicators with qualitative depth stories, like actual monthly testimonies of lives genuinely changed, or maybe examples of leaders who navigated a crisis using the tools they learned through this formation process. So the metrics prove the system is working, but the depth stories, they prove the system matters.
Okay, that makes sense. It connects the dots. And it sets us up nicely for the next section, the actual blueprint for multiplication. If we accept this idea that the real goal is reproduction building, something that can self-propagate, and not just gathering a crowd, what's the fundamental shift needed in how we bring new people on board, how we treat them?
The fundamental shift is moving people from being consumers to being producers, or maybe participants to partners. Multiplication in this model only really sparks when ordinary disciples, ordinary team members, become reproducers, not just spectators watching from the sidelines. And this shift happens during what they call the seedling stage, which isn't just like a quick orientation week. It's a defined period of really intentional care, protection, and deep nourishment where those crucial roots get established.
So how do you actually embed this multiplication DNA? What does that training look like day to day for just a regular person, someone who's got a job, family, busy life? It can't be super complex if it needs to replicate easily, right?
Exactly right. Complexity is the absolute enemy of multiplication here. The core strategy has to be simplicity and repeatability. Embedding multiplication DNA means training every new believer or every new team member pretty quickly, like within weeks of joining, to do a few basic things. Share their own foundational story, lead a really simple discussion or study, and follow a basic reproducible pathway. And that pathway has to be short and memorable, maybe 4 to 6 steps max, something that moves people predictably from just exploring to actually reproducing the process themselves. The absolute key is keeping the process low complexity, so low that anyone who's gone through it can easily teach it to someone else. That way you break the dependence on just one charismatic leader or the expert in the room.
Okay, to make this really practical, the sources talk about a tool called the 90-day seedling sprint, a time-bound plan to speed up building that durability. But wow, 90 days sounds intense. How do you stop people burning out with that kind of accelerated commitment?
Yeah, the intensity is intentional, but it's structured around depth, not just frantic activity. The idea is to front-load the most critical habit formation early on before all the usual external pressures crowd it out. So, the first month, days 130, it's all about root and relate. This means launching a simple Discovery Bible pathway. That's a way of reading scripture focused on conversation and obedience, not just information. And critically, forming accountability triads.
Okay, pause there. Triads. For listeners who maybe haven't run into this, why a triad specifically? Just 3 people, what's the purpose?
Good question. A triad is deliberately small, usually 1 mentor and 2 apprentices. It's intentional for a couple of reasons. First, it's low demand logistically, easy to schedule, builds trust quickly, highly confidential. Second, and this is key, it embeds the reproduction idea right from the start. The expectation is that the 2 apprentices will become mentors themselves, each starting their own triad within a set time frame. It's designed to be the simplest possible engine for multiplication.
Okay, got it. Simple, reproducible. So after setting up those relational roots and the triad rhythm in month 1, what's month 2 about?
Days 31 to the 60 coast pivot towards practice and prototype. This is where the apprentices shift gears from mostly passive learning to active doing. They actually start co-leading simple gatherings or meetings. And the triad meetings themselves incorporate some key accountability elements, like an obedience check-in.
An obedience check-in. That's the interesting language. What does that actually
Yeah.
involve?
Yeah, it's the mechanism designed to bridge the gap between knowing something and doing something. So instead of just asking, hey, what did you learn this week? The triad asks, how did you actually obey what you learned? Or maybe, what one specific action are you committing to take this week based on what we just discussed? It forces a concrete, measurable step. The second month also introduces what they call the open seat mission principle, which just means every meeting, every gathering is held with the expectation and the readiness to welcome and include a newcomer at any time. The whole point of this phase is to move people from that initial, maybe fragile enthusiasm towards becoming part of a durable, generative structure, something that can actually reproduce itself without the founder constantly propping it up.
That really clarifies the path from fragile excitement to, yeah, durable structure. But even great structures get tested, right? Which brings us to the third big idea, forging spiritual grit. What happens when this lovely blueprint hits the fan? You know, the funding suddenly dries up, a key leader walks away, or maybe the whole culture shifts against your mission.
Yeah, that's the reality check, isn't it? And this is exactly where that intentional formation work is supposed to pay off. The core problem they identify is this widespread, often unspoken expectation that things should be easy, that faith or commitment should lead to smooth sailing. So many organizations, even individuals, are kind of formed into a structure that expects linear progress, constant prosperity, rather than building for endurance. Then, when a real crisis hits, financial crunch, leadership scandal, unexpected hardship, that whole idealistic structure gets exposed as brittle. And people can fall into despair because their worldview just wasn't prepared for it. And this is where the material gets, I think, really profound. It pushes hard for reframing adversity entirely. Suffering isn't presented as a failure of the plan. It's often the very pathway to maturity. Trials aren't detours, they're framed as a forge or a crucible. A context where resilience isn't just tested, it's actually formed. They draw a lot on ancient wisdom here, like James 1, talking about the testing of faith producing perseverance.
And they really stress that resilience isn't some solo act of just gritting your teeth, right?
Precisely. That's a huge point.
Mhm.
Resilience is social, not solo. You can't forge real grit in isolation. It absolutely requires community scaffolding, those triads we talked about, the open tables, the shared rhythms. These relational structures become the safety net. They're what can prevent people from just jumping ship when the pressure feels overwhelming.
And the sources give us another practical tool here, the fourfold narrative, to help guide people through really deep suffering and avoid what they call spiritual bypass. That's a striking term. Can you define that and explain how this narrative template helps fight it?
Yeah, spiritual bypass is basically using spiritual language or concepts like saying, oh, it was just God's plan, or I just need to stay positive to kind of gloss over, intellectualize, or frankly, avoid feeling difficult, painful, messy emotions. It leads to really shallow healing, if any. The fourfold narrative template is designed to force an integration of that pain into an honest, coherent story.
Okay, so how does that template work? What are the steps?
It's a pretty simple, guided process, best used with a mentor or within that trusted triad. You start with 1. What happened? Just the verifiable facts, trying to strip away emotional interpretation for a moment. Then 2. How did it feel? This is absolutely crucial. It's about making space for honest emotion, for lament, allowing anger, sadness, frustration, confusion. No platitudes allowed here. 3. What questions do you have about God or meaning? This encourages wrestling honestly with the hard theological questions, the doubts, the whys we're often scared to voice, again, resisting easy answers. And finally, 4, what humble action can you take now? This shifts focus back to agency, even in suffering. It's about identifying one small, faithful step forward, something manageable that keeps you moving. This whole process helps shift the focus from just trying to avoid pain to actually integrating it into a larger story of formation and growth.
That makes sense. It turns the crucible experience into something that can genuinely lead to maturity, not just, scar tissue.
Exactly. It helps create narrative coherence out of chaos, which is really, at its heart, what resilience is all about.
Okay, last section. Let's bring this whole blueprint down into the nitty-gritty of daily life. This isn't just about big strategic plans or crisis moments. It's about what the authors call a kingdom life pattern. What does that look like maybe outside a purely faith context, say in a more general organizational setting?
Well, the core issue they're tackling is fragmentation. How we tend to silo our deepest values or our faith into a separate spiritual room in our lives, disconnected from work, family, finances, everything else. The solution proposed is this integrated kingdom life pattern, or you could call it a personal rule of life. It's basically a set of intentional, chosen habits designed to weave your core values, things like integrity, generosity, focus, peace, into the actual fabric of your daily routines, across your job, your family life, how you handle money, how you resolve conflicts.
If I'm listening and I run a startup or maybe I manage a team, this rule of life isn't just about, say, meditating for 10 minutes. It's about actually installing maybe non-negotiable boundaries or practices into my workday.
Precisely. If your stated value is, say, people development or team well-being, but you're constantly rushing, skipping one-on-ones, and never having margin, well, your daily behavior is undermining your stated value. So a rule of life might mandate something concrete, like a digital Sabbath, one day truly offline, or maybe specific non-negotiable time blocks scheduled first for focused, deep work, or for relational connection with your team, even if it feels inefficient in the moment. The idea is that your core principles or your spiritual life shouldn't be just one room in the house. They should be the foundation that shapes how all the rooms are built and used.
And the sources really hammer home that this foundation itself rests on 2 inseparable practices. They need to be prioritized in any daily pattern: Scripture and prayer. Why are these seen as the absolute engine rooms for this root system?
Yeah, they're consistently identified as the primary ways this deep rooting and stability actually happen. Scripture, or foundational texts relevant to your values, provides the content. It gives you the doctrine, the narrative, the identity framework. It clarifies purpose and provides a sturdy structure for understanding the world and your place in it. Prayer, or perhaps reflective practice, on the other hand, is what makes that content personal and responsive. It turns static knowledge into a dynamic conversation, a relationship, a moment of maybe surrender or alignment. The argument is that neglecting either one ultimately starves the roots, making the whole structure vulnerable when, the cultural winds shift or personal storms hit.
I think a lot of listeners get the idea of daily prayer or reflection or engaging with core texts, but consistency is where it falls apart. What practical path do the sources suggest for building this slowly, sturdily, avoiding that initial heroic burst that just leads to burnout?
Yeah, that's key. They strongly recommend simple, repeatable rhythms over sheer intensity. Forget trying to carve out an hour every morning if it's unrealistic. That just sets you up for failure after 3 days. Instead, they suggest adopting really simple structures, like the SOP method for engaging with a text.
Okay, quick refresher on SOP. It comes up a lot in these kinds of materials.
Yeah.
What are the observations and application steps really asking for?
Right. SOP stands for Scripture, Observation, Application, Prayer. Observation isn't just passive reading, it's active engagement. Asking things like, okay, what does this short passage actually say? What does it teach me about God's character or about true north principles? Or what pattern or keyword jumps out at me here? Then application moves straight to action. Okay, based on that observation, how might this change what I think, say, or do today? What's one concrete takeaway? It forces that link between the reading and your actual daily life, your rule of life. And then they often map out a simple daily rhythm, drawing on some ancient practices, like maybe a 15 to 25-minute morning time, focused on that Lectio-style reading slow, meditative, followed by just a short response prayer or reflection. Then a midday anchor, could be super short, like a 5-minute breath prayer, or just a moment to recenter yourself amidst the chaos. And finally, an evening time, maybe using the examine practice, focusing on reflection and thanksgiving.
And the examine, just briefly.
The examine is a simple review of your day, typically done in the evening. You look back not just for mistakes, but asking, where did I see my values in action today? Where did I feel aligned? Where did I miss the mark? It fosters both gratitude and honest self-awareness, leading to gentle course correction for tomorrow. This whole approach, morning, midday, evening, using simple tools like SOAP, it's designed to build those roots slowly and sturdily without requiring this massive upfront willpower that rarely lasts.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. We've mapped this journey from just surviving to genuinely thriving, from chasing fragile outputs to building sustainable, durable communities or organizations. We looked at escaping the survival trap, the blueprint for multiplication with that 90-day sprint, the absolute necessity of forging spiritual grit through trials, and finally, the daily architecture needed for a rooted life pattern.
Indeed. And I think the thread running through it all is this relentless intentionality. It's about prioritizing the often hidden, slow work of developing roots. It's about designing reproducible, low-complexity ways of being and doing right from the start. And it's about cultivating resilience, not in spite of suffering, but often through shared adversity. These seem to be the core elements, according to these sources, that create real durability when everything else feels like it's starting to fracture.
So what does all this mean for you, listening right now? The sources really drive home this point. The biggest danger to lasting growth, whether personal or organizational, probably isn't a lack of passion or resources. It's more likely a failure to consistently tend the soil, to prioritize the depth of internal formation over the speed of external results.
Which leads to maybe a final thought to chew on. If the true measure of growth for your organization, your team, or even just your own personal development is really the legacy of lives changed, measured by faithfulness and deep formation, then what's one small, repeatable habit you could start this week? Something concrete to consciously shift your focus, even just a little, from visible activity towards that hidden, patient work of formation.